Hello, good evening and welcome to Biz First Review 360, your weekly roundup of the top business news and developments impacting the Sri Lankan economy. This week in Sri Lanka has been crazy. We've seen the return of trade union action, protests by the Government Medical Officers Association, and we also saw former Secretary to the President Lalit Weeratunga and former Director General of the TRC or Telecommunications Regulatory Commission Anusha Palpita being enlarged on bail mere weeks after they were convicted for misappropriating 600 million rupees of public funds. Also this week we saw the passage of the highly controversial Provincial Council Elections Amendment Act with a two-thirds majority in Parliament. All of this happened while President Maithripala Sirisena was miles away in New York at the United Nations General Assembly. Well, that's a recap of events in the political arena. Let's take a look at the stories that made headlines in business.
The European Union has pledged 5.4 billion rupees to improve living conditions in the Uva and Central provinces in the island. Funds which will be channeled through non-governmental organizations such as CARE, ACTED, Oxfam and Adventist Development and Relief Agency will benefit poor rural communities in Monaragala, Badulla in the Uva province and Nuwara Eliya and Matale districts in the Central province. The grant is part of EU's wider program of support to rural development in Sri Lanka and focuses on promoting economic growth in rural and estate sector, building small businesses and building awareness of chronic kidney disease. The World Bank has said it's eager to engage more with the government to mitigate climate-related disasters. This was revealed when the Executive Director of the World Bank for the constituency of India, Bangladesh, Bhutan and Sri Lanka, Ms. S. Aparna, together with the World Bank's Country Director for Sri Lanka and the Maldives, Mrs. Ida Z. Swarai Ridihov, called on the Ministry of Finance and Media, Mr. Mangala Samaravira, at the Ministry of Finance this week. Discussions had also focused on how the government could leverage resources to achieve sustainable development goals and integrate more with nations in South Asia. The World Bank had commended the government on the positive social indicators displayed in the fields of health, education, literacy rate and life expectancy.
Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, addressing the International Organization of Securities Commission GEM Annual Committee, said the government is focusing on bringing in laws to boost exports and investments.
We have strengthened the external position of our country by accumulating international reserves to better face global market vulnerability. We are taking a series of measures to increase non-debt creating inflows, particularly through the enhancing of exports and attracting FDI. We are entering into bilateral economic partnership agreement with a number of countries to enhance the market access. We have achieved the reinstatement of GSP Plus facility by the EU. We are strengthening institutional capacity in trade and FDI through the establishment of relevant agencies, and we are striving to improve the business environment. Improvements in trade facilitation are also ongoing. We will address greater exchange flexibility under the proposed inflation targeting framework, helping to improve the country's external competition. There is a separate task force on investments and exports. A single window legislation on a single window clearance committee is also ready and being drafted. With this, we are working on our exports, our competitiveness. We are looking at the service sector, the tourism sector, a logistics center where Sri Lanka develops all its three ports, Colombo, Hambantota, Trincomalee, and its two airports, linked together by the infrastructure for which we are paid already from Kandy to Hambantota.
Addressing the gathering, Premier Wickremesinghe said new laws are needed with regard to the Central Bank, the Securities Exchange Commission and the Stock Exchange.
Stay tuned to Biz First Review 360. On the other side of this break, our main event tonight, a chat on the National Export Strategy. Welcome back to Biz First Review 360. We're going to talk a little bit about Sri Lanka's National Export Strategy and the challenges and opportunities that Sri Lankan exports face in the global market. We're joined by Mr. Rohan Masakorala, the CEO of the Shippers Academy Colombo, also a consultant at the Export Development Board. Rohan, thank you very much for coming on the show once again. Let me start by asking you, now you've been with the EDB for some time now. What is Sri Lanka's national export strategy? Do we have like an overarching national export strategy?
Up to now, I think we didn't have a national export strategy. We were talking about exports for a very long time. Exports have had a bad stint for about 20 years because it was a lot of talk but no action, and then off and on we have been losing some of the abilities to access markets. So I think I should give the credit to the Ministry of International Trade, who has taken an initiative with the funding supported by the European governments. The International Trade Center is in operation in Colombo with the EDB to develop a national export strategy for Sri Lanka so that we increase our exports at least by twice within a reasonable time.
With the possibility of elections, either local government or provincial council, we don't know which, being around the corner, that has dominated the national conversation. But not too long ago, the national dialogue, if you will, was dominated by free trade agreements. EDCA, the free trade agreement that was in the pipeline with Singapore, with China, etc. What is the progress that has been made in terms of these free trade agreements, and how do these agreements, bilateral and multilateral agreements, feature into the national export strategy?
Yeah, well, always politics takes ahead of business in this country, so obviously people talk more about the elections that are upcoming or going to happen, so that's a natural thing as far as I am concerned. But the work is going ahead. The National Export Strategy document should be out by towards November. We are in discussions at right now in regional levels. We are consulting the regional operators of the various sectors. Does
this export strategy document make any mention of free trade agreements?
Each sector, I think, is mentioned in our, for example, I am handling boat building and logistics. So we are talking about the importance of market access and free trade agreements to expand exports. Because one of the problems Sri Lanka has been having is we don't have much of market access into major markets with bilateral or multilateral arrangements that can in fact bring in new FDI to the country for manufacturing and re-export. For example, if you look at Mexico, has about 45 free trade agreements. That's why they are very strong manufacturing and export oriented country. Similarly, Singapore has close to 30 FTAs or bilateral, multilateral arrangements. Sri Lanka has about 5, but actively about 1 or 2, and of course the GSP Plus has been a unilateral thing given to us by Europe. So that's a positive thing for the exports for the European market access. So the export strategy also talks about the FTAs, all FTAs, future FTAs, as well as the European opportunity.
What is the real hurdle, or what are the real cuffs or manacles that are holding back Sri Lanka? Is it that we aren't diversified enough in terms of our export market, or is it that we just don't have the level of investment to support a vibrant export sector?
Few things. I think since the liberalization in 1977, I think we took off very well for the first 6 years by having export processing zones created, and there was a huge focus by the then government for export-led growth. We saw that happening in the early 70s, late 70s, early 80s. Then of course, due to various problems, the focus went off, and since 1992, where the garment industry was heavily focused by the then president, investing into the regions and creating new factories and employment. That's how the garment industry started growing in the 90s. That momentum went, but after that there was nothing really big happening in Sri Lanka. Everybody talked about export, but the lack of focus was there. So as a result, we all know that as a percentage of GDP, exports have now dropped to around 13-14% of GDP. One time when it was 30-35% of GDP. So we are striving to get towards at least 20-25% of GDP over the next 5 years or so. If we can hit that transformation, then the country will get into a technology-based next level of manufacturing. As you said, one of the weaknesses we always had, we were considered as a vulnerable economy because our export basket was tea, rubber, coconut, historically from the British time, and then came garments, little bit of gems, little bit of fisheries. That's it. We are not a diversified export economy. So the 10.3 billion right now is a very small figure when the global export market is worth about $20 trillion.
Ms. Maskora, you're a very respected person within the shipping and logistics sector. You mentioned that you're consulting on boat building and logistics on the national export strategy. Do you think that Sri Lanka has a lot of potential when it comes to shipbuilding, or are we too late to the party?
No, there are two segments. Shipbuilding, we are not going to be competitive, and because it takes a lot of capital as well as labor intensive, low labor cost, like or high tech, other way around. But boat building is different. We define a boat up to 24 meters is a boat. So we are talking of pleasure craft, or other ocean craft like fishing craft, sporting activities. So we want to build yacht marinas here, attract yachts. We just don't want to build boats, but we've been building boats. There have been talented boat manufacturers.
There has been a lot of talk about this, and
yes.
I've always been interested in this, being a minor aficionado of sailing. Successive governments or successive ministers have spoken of having marinas here, of introducing a boating culture in Sri Lanka. They've said that there's a lot of untapped potential there, but these visions have never manifested in reality. And that seems to be the story with every strategy. I mean, the boat building, that marina culture, that's just one aspect of it, but these visions not manifesting into reality seems to be the story of even with infrastructure development. How will your approach with the national export strategy and the EDB and ITC, how will this approach be different? How will it ensure that this becomes a reality?
Yeah, good question. You're absolutely right. A lot of talk has been happening about expanding this sector. Potential is very high. We are trying to untangle we're trying to understand what's wrong. So we've realized that there's legislative issues, land issues, multi-agencies handling various environment, fisheries, various ministries, cross-cutting policy decisions. So what this export strategy is, why it is called a national export strategy, is finally it will go to the cabinet, and all the ministries, secretaries are involved in the whole process, will be involved in the whole process, and it will be the responsibility of the government to give each ministry the path that we have shown to facilitate this process. So we are not going to tell 100 things. We will tell about 10-15 things that can be achieved over a period of 5 years, because we don't expect magic out of a system like that. So we need to have a transition, but we are very positive. Even the government sector people who have been working with us as team has shown us a way forward. So we have identified key ministries, then supporting ministries who would play in a core team to get the action plan we have called point of action prioritized over a period of 5 years. The NES strategy is done by the International Trade Center. Actually, I work for the International Trade Center, not to the EDB. So under the ITC, we are developing this point of action by consulting the trade. We look at the global situation, what's there out there, what are the strengths, and how can Sri Lanka get into this so-called value chain. It does not about just building boats.
Yeah. So the experts are busy drafting the policy and the strategy, figuring out the areas where Sri Lanka can find space to operate in. Are you confident? Do you trust the government to implement the strategy that you developed?
Whatever we do, if we don't have trust and hope, nothing will take off, right? We have to keep on trying. I know why you are asking this question is, in the past I too have had this experience in various areas. We've been talking some things for 20 years, right? Things don't happen because there's no seriousness. But I have a funny feeling that things are better this time around with ITC around, and if the government is keen on certain, the vision itself, it has nothing to do with our thinking. We saw independent vision being thrown out by the Prime Minister and the President for the country by 2025. I think that aligns with our thinking of certain change. So that's, we are talking about 8 years down the line. So we have a 5-year plan. If we can achieve 50% or something like that, certainly the country will move on to a next value chain, next value added chain in the boat building, and get some investors into the country to set up operations. Land and things is the government's responsibility to give us the.
So after so many years of working on policy and strategy in shipping and logistics, in exports, etc., you're finally confident that this is when we're ready to take off?
Yes, there's some kind of a feeling and a momentum that okay, things are being put into place, or structurally putting into correct place, but executing part is the blueprints executed.
We have to still be hopeful and optimistic.
I'm optimistic and hopeful.
Well, it's good to have some optimism here on the show after some time. Thank you very much, Rohan, for coming on the program once again.
Okay.
Biz First Review 360 will be right back after this short commercial break. Welcome back to Biz First Review 360. We're in conversation with Mr. Rohan Masakorala, CEO of the Shippers Academy of Colombo, regarding Sri Lanka's export strategy, or the drafting of Sri Lanka's export strategy, in which Rohan is, of course, involved in from the perspective of boat building and logistics. Rohan, can I ask you, the budget is coming up. This November, the appropriations bill will be put to Parliament. What do you expect as a professional? What are you looking for from the budget to assist in your sector, to assist in trade, in exports?
Yeah, good question. Through the NES, through the last consultations, I think there are about altogether 8 sectors, priority sectors and assisting sectors selected to develop exports. So identified sectors like wellness, tourism, spices, various other things. Among that, services, IT and boat building and logistics come into play. Now we have had couple of consultants with the local industry, and we have asked them as the players who are in the industry to prioritize some of the things that has to be put to the upcoming budget. So we put from the already required changes required by the trade, we have submitted to the Ministry of Finance through the EDB what can be accommodated for the 2018 year. Not the full NES program, but whatever priorities we have put. So each sector has put 2 financial requirements and 2 non-financial requirements. Now I can tell you, if you look at the boat building area, the number one what we have required is the Berual area, a $21 million requirement to build a yacht marina. So we don't know whether the government will allocate, but that's a requirement from the industry, which they have done a project. Similarly, from the logistics industry, they have asked for funding for to put up R&D and data facility to understand the interior logistics centers and how to connect the north-south corridors
on
for logistics.
On the subject of connectivity, we saw with the launch of the Vision 2025 document, very ambitious plans in developing Trincomalee, Hambantota. Then we heard about the Ruanpura expressway to Ratnapura. When you look at the plans that have been put in place, do you feel that they are realistic? Do you feel that we've got the priorities straight? For example, last week, not last week actually, on Monday on our show Face the Nation, we had a former Transport Secretary and a former Acting Director General of the RDA. And they said that, look, infrastructure planning happens over a very long period of time. But this was the first time that either of them had even heard of this Ruanpura project. Do you think that electoral compulsions are messing up economic priorities? with the Vision 2025 document and the plan for logistics?
Vision 2025 is good but ambitious. I don't know whether we can achieve all that what we are looking by 2025 at the current pace of things happening. But it's good to be ambitious also, because you need to have plans. Rather than going into a specific road network or something, I think you have to look at where the populations are and where the business is going to happen, and those areas as island have to be linked to the main logistics corridors. So Colombo and Hambantota are going to be definitely major seaports, because China will make it happen sooner or later. Then Trincomalee is being studied by the Singaporean group, how it can be, because Bay of Bengal traffic also could increase in the medium to long term, because all the Indian east coast as well as the Bay of Bengal countries, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Thailand, all are developing rapidly, and there is a lot of activity happening along the sea coast in those areas. So Trincomalee being a natural deep water port, and it can handle more oil tanks and things like that to facilitate regional distribution. Sri Lanka is located, I always say, it's much more than a transshipment location. If you look at the Indian Ocean map, you will see how it's located and its ability to be a great distribution center. For that, we have to get our legal systems reformed, the labor laws of 50, 60, 100-year-old customs procedures. These things have to be cleared up by government. So we have recommended one of the, as budget proposals, we are told that please get your regulations right, whether it's ports, customs, those have to be in line with global standards, even for foreign FDI to look at investing. That's a fact. But all that given, we are in for a good show if we can get our act together.
So you think that if the government, if at the upcoming budget, these regulatory problems are addressed, if these concerns that industry has regarding regulations are addressed, then that would make achieving the Vision 2025 dream a lot more closer.
Yeah, because okay, the government has mentioned the ease of doing business. They are focusing specifically on the activities to correct them. Then they are talking about the single window facilitation. So if these things are put right, cargo movement becomes faster, which means it becomes more scalable and economically viable for global companies to do business here. Right now we are not in a very attractive doing business or a logistics index, because our legal systems, the time taken to get approvals, things like that are horrendous, I would say, compared to global standards.
With the ease of doing business, many people, a lot of voters actually, expected that with the change of government in 2015 and then again in 2015 August, in January and when and then in August when the UMP gained more seats in Parliament, that it would be a more business friendly environment. But Sri Lanka's position in the doing business, ease of doing business index actually went down.
Correct.
How do you explain this?
Well, always once you have a change of government, you have to look at the existing procedures and what has happened. I mean, we have to look at from where we started. In 2009 we were way behind, then the war ended and a lot of things got into place, and then of course again the systems of the country became governed by ARFR circulars, so systems all get entangled into each other and systems becomes messy. So what we are as professionals also we are trying to do is understand and dismantle all these procedures and have a more simpler process, and that is in line only we can see it. So these things take time, they can go down and come up for a while, because to dismantle an entangled system is also a bit of a process taking time, and when people change, heads of government change, secretaries change, they take quite a while to understand what was there, and then the whole thing gets slowed down. So there's a procedural delays also. But now, since I'm involved, I can say that there is a lot of focus and teams working on different areas. Results may take another 1 or 2 years at least for some of these things to be implemented. For example, the payment gateway, the online payment gateway was ready 1.5 years back, but due to other interferences it got delayed, and then It only came about a month back that we can have online payments to customs. So it took 1.5 years when it was ready actually during the previous regime's end. But then as the regime changed, they looked at it and there was various interest and interferences. So obviously that made the whole system delayed, and finally it came.
One last question before I let you go, Rohan. The Inland Revenue Bill was initially touted as this legislation that will completely overhaul the tax system. Now that didn't happen. It didn't completely overhaul it, but there were some key changes that were made. As far as trade and industry and transport, logistics, your sector is concerned, is this the new tax laws? Are they that will come into effect in April next year? Is that a step in the right direction? Is it useful for your industry?
It's in a step in the right direction, because why I say is logistics tax have been brought down from 28 to 14%. That's a huge reduction for the logistics industry. Exports have gone up from 10 or 12 to 14%. I think that's fair enough, because government needs revenue also, and at this moment maybe things can change after 5 years down the line. So they've given us a kind of a concrete feeling that okay, this is going to be a tax system, and the SVAT system, which was going to be removed, has been retained. So that has been looked by the exporters as a very positive move to retain it and then bring some kind of standardization between logistics and exports into a 14 bracket altogether. So I think there is positives in that sense of the budget.
Do you see exports reaching about 20% of GDP by the end of 2020?
It's a tough call. 20% of GDP is a tough call, but they are looking at going towards that. But of course, if we start opening up for regional trade to flow through Sri Lanka, what's called the Commercial Hub Act, where regional value addition can come in, it might be not direct exports, but indirect exports also will take off, and there's a possibility that we can reach, I wouldn't say we can reach 20% of GDP by 2020, but we might be able to get to about 17 or so, 16, 17, if the policies are implemented and FDIs come and invest here, and we open up for FTAs between markets, Sri Lankan access market, exporters getting market access better. Even it can be better if things are right. So I hope so for that better number also.
So once again, you're going to remain optimistic.
I have to be remaining optimistic because I am in that industry and I believe in export-driven economic growth. So I have to be optimistic whether I like it or not.
Rohan, thank you very much for coming on the program. Once again, I wish you all the best. Well, those were the thoughts and the hopes of Mr. Rohan Masakorala, the CEO of the Shippers Academy of Colombo, on Sri Lanka becoming an export-driven economy. And that's a wrap of our program for tonight. Don't forget to look us up on Facebook. You'll find us at Biz First Review 360. That's 1 and 360 in numerals. I'll see you again, same time, same place next week. Good night and good luck.